Ezekiel 28 is our other passage that, like Isaiah 14 that we went through last, contains a number of significant examples. I happen to think even more powerful and even more direct statements than are in the symbolic statements of Isaiah are in the statements of Ezekiel 28 that I personally believe are referring to Satan and to the corruption that instigated his fall, and thus are an evidence of the type of corruption that entered into the celestial realm and the angelic host. Ezekiel 28:12 says, Son of man, take up a lamentation against the king of Tyrus, which is Tyre, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Just as was the case with Isaiah 14, this is an example of a passage that many church scholars of a wide range of doctrinal backgrounds and even denominations believe was referring to Satan for much of the history of the church. It's just been in the last several hundred years that some have begun to more commonly claim that this is referring just to human rulers. And for some of the reasons I'm not going to go over again that I talked about when I talked about Isaiah 14. Those who do not agree that this is talking about Satan, and particularly those among our churches who do not believe Satan is a single supernatural entity, believe that supernatural references here that appear to be referring to something far more than human are just poetic metaphors, perhaps sarcasm, hyperbole, or even extreme irony that's being used in these statements. Some even believe that these are statements that the human ruler is making about himself in some kind of dramatic expression of hubris. But the statements here are not being made by the human ruler, they're being made by the Lord. So when we read these statements, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that either the Lord is using massive hyperbole in these statements, or he's talking about a supernatural being. And you do realize that hyperbole can get very close to lying and deception. And so I am very careful in claiming that God is using hyperbole. I wouldn't argue that he may use hyperbole in some cases where he's exaggerating something intentionally and he expects you to understand it's exaggerated. But these statements are far too straightforward and direct for me to come to the conclusion they are just sarcastic hyperbole of some kind, especially when it's talking about holy things, which lead me to believe that this is talking about an individual who is far more than just human in nature, given that God is describing them in that way. And as you're going to see when we look at some of the list of descriptions that are used for them, some of them are never used for a human being anywhere else in the Bible. So I think interpreting this as a literal human king that's the king of Tyrus is a serious stretch when you consider some of the statements that are made about this person. I realize that some will say it says the king of Tyrus, so that has to mean the human king of Tyre. But as I pointed out about the king of Babylon in Isaiah, and I'm not going to go back into here, there are precedents for that kind of language being used for celestial beings, as we see in Daniel 10. And even if you didn't accept Daniel 10, there's no reason that a celestial being cannot be referred to as a ruler, which is all that these titles, king and prince, are referring to. But I'll come back to that. I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but just consider some of the statements made about this individual and whether or not you truly believe this is referring to a human being, or that God would use this level of hyperbole, and whether you realize it or not, even potentially what could be conveyed as disrespect for his own holy things, to refer to somebody that is human and couldn't have possibly actually been or done the things in these descriptions. One of the first things he says about him in the 13th verse that we're going to look at is, Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Has any human being been in Eden prior to Christ? And this prophecy, by the way, was made more than 700 years before Jesus was born. Has any human being been in Eden literally or even metaphorically since the time that Eden was closed to humankind and the cherubim were put before it to prevent them from going into Eden? Obviously, no one has literally. Then in the 14th verse, he refers to him as the anointed cherub that covereth. Again, we'll go into that in more detail in a few minutes. But there is not one single example in the entire Bible of any human being who is referred to as a cherub, even in the most prophetically poetic expressions. There's a man who has a similar name, but there is no human who is referred to as, or with the title of, a cherub. Also in that 14th verse, it refers to him as being upon the holy mountain of God. Now you might argue that some pagan king came up on the holy mountain of God in Jerusalem. Since there are those who are determined to believe this is only an historical king of Tyre, then I would challenge them to come up with an historical reference, the king of Tyre coming up on the holy mountain of God in Jerusalem in some historical context. And I wish them luck finding it. In the 15th verse, it says he was perfect in his ways from the day that he was created till iniquity was found in him. This is just as powerful as him being called a cherub, if not more powerful, in terms of proving that this could not be a human being. There is no human being, period, who could be referred to as perfect in their ways from the day they were created until they committed iniquity, when human beings are born in sin and conceived in iniquity. The only human beings that could possibly be referred to with that kind of language would be Adam and Eve. And this is clearly referring to someone who is still alive and active at the time of Isaiah in the 700s BC, at least 2,300 years after the time of Adam and Eve. And in the 16th verse, God says, I will cast thee as profane on the mountain of God. I will destroy thee, O covering cherub. Again, referring to him as a cherub and casting him as profane on the mountain of God, as if somehow the mountain of God was the place he was inhabiting. There's no king of Tyre in history that was inhabiting the mountain of God like that was his normal place to be and that would be cast out of it in any context. Very seldom do you even see a hint that any of the kings of Tyre even came to Jerusalem, let alone they could be described in this kind of language. Those 5 things I just noted are strong reasons to believe this is not a human ruler, no matter how hyperbolic you might think the language might be. If you're going to use just 1 or 2 highly exaggerated metaphors or examples of hyperbole to refer to a human being, that would be one thing. But when you look at this passage, it contains an overwhelming list of superhuman descriptions that simply cannot be referring to a human. Again, if somebody just used 1, you might say that is extreme hyperbole to use 1. It's beyond extreme hyperbole to use the list that is found in this passage. And to apply statements that are initially very highly favorable regarding him being in a state of perfection and being located in heaven at some point would be astonishing, if not ludicrous, to try to apply to a pagan human king. Some believe the passage is describing the king of Tyre here, being in Eden, is just describing Adam or is just a metaphor for something Adamic in nature. But that has serious contextual and chronological problems, as you'll see. Some include the prince of Tyre, that's described in Ezekiel 28:1-11 as Satan as well, arguing that from Ezekiel 28:1 all the way through these verses and beyond, it's talking about Satan. Sometimes arguing that the first 11 verses are describing his condition after his fall, and the 12th verse onward is describing his condition prior to his fall. I don't hold that position. Some also allegorize the prince of Tyre in Ezekiel 21:8-11 as symbolic of the false prophet or man of sin, who's under the control of the invisible power that is the king of Tyre, which is Satan. You could also argue that the prince of Tyre in the first 11 verses is the human ruler of Tyre, and the king of Tyre is the invisible celestial being who is influencing that human ruler. I believe their deepest fulfillment, starting with this 12th verse in particular, is a description of the conditions of someone who is not the human ruler of Tyre. I think that human ruler, as I gave the last possibility, is probably the prince that's referred to in the titles that precede this, but the invisible ruler behind that prince, who is the one being referred to as the king here. The title prince, by the way, in the 2nd verse of this chapter is the Hebrew word nagid, which is a word that can mean leader and comes from a root that many scholars believe refers to someone who is the one in front, which would be very significant if that's its meaning, considering what I just pointed out, that the prince in the first 11 verses might be the one in front, the visible one, the human who is doing the ruling and the talking and acting, while somebody who is behind him is the true power behind the throne, that invisible entity who is Satan. Jusinius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon of the Old Testament says about this word that it refers to someone who is apparently to be in front, to be in sight, or the one that is manifest. And Brown Driver Briggs says that it refers to someone who's the one who's conspicuous. In other words, the visible one. So thus, as I said, the prince in the first 11 verses could literally be the one in front, not only in his role as the leader who's out in front, but in that he was the visible leader in front, the one that was in front while there was an invisible leader behind the throne who was influencing him. And I base that on the fact that it appears that the king of Tyre in this verse is being contrasted with the prince of Tyre in the first 11 verses. King here is the word usually translated king, the Hebrew word melech, which means a king or a ruler. And though the prince of Tyre might be the visible leader, there does appear to be an invisible ruler behind the throne. It says of him, "Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty." The Hebrew word translated sum here is taknit, which means the pattern or model or measure, which means he seals up the pattern or the measure. There's only one other place in the Bible where that Hebrew word is used, where it is translated pattern in the King James Version. It's in Ezekiel 43:10 when it says, "Thou son of man, show the house to the house of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and let them measure the pattern." There's several different ways you might interpret this statement about him sealing up the sum and being full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Could be a reference to the fact that he was the model of a perfect creation in his original form and in his originally intended functions when he was first created by Christ. And if he was the first being created by Christ, as some traditions have believed, that could mean that he was in some sense the pattern or measure upon which the creation of other celestial beings was modeled, which is very close to what the language here is stating, that he is a model of some kind. I think what Adam Clark said about this passage is interesting. He said the phrase, "thou sealest up," can be translated, "thou drawest thy own likeness. Thou formest a portrait of thyself, and hast represented thyself the perfection of wisdom and beauty." If that's true, it could refer to Satan seeing himself as the perfect image of beauty. Rather than conforming himself the image of God like Jesus did, he made himself the image. And then like Adam, he sowed his spiritual seed to create others in that image rather than in God's image, and thus attempting to make himself a creator and God in some sense. Then Ezekiel 28:13 says, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, the diamond, the beryl, onyx, jasper, sapphire, emerald, carbuncle, and gold. The workmanship of thy tabrets and of thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast created." If he was in Eden, the garden of God, there are only two possible logical interpretations you could make of that statement. One is a highly sarcastic and extremely hyperbolic statement regarding a human being that wasn't true in any way. There is an example of that kind of language, though I think it could be referring to Satan in the same way I think it is in these passages as the power behind the throne instead of the actual king, when you see the description of the king of Assyria in Ezekiel 31. It says about him, "The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him. The fir trees were not like his boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like his branches, nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in his beauty. I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied him." Now that is a much more poetic way of potentially referring to someone as being in Eden or the garden of God. But as I stated earlier, I do not believe that there are any statements describing human beings in the way it's stated here in Ezekiel as being in the garden of God. This is extremely poetic language in Ezekiel 31 and not quite as direct, and especially when you look at the original language, as a statement we see here in Ezekiel 28:13. Not only that, as I said a minute ago, I could potentially make the same argument in Ezekiel 31 that I'm making here, that this is not talking about the literal king of Assyria. In this statement, it's talking about the invisible ruler behind him, who is Satan. If this being was in Eden, the garden of God, as Ezekiel 28:13 describes us, it could only be referring to Satan, to Adam, or to Eve. So if this is talking about the serpent who was in the garden, since it can't be talking about Adam and Eve, then it has to be talking about Satan. The terms Eden and the Garden of God can be used to refer to the literal physical Garden of Eden that was in the earth that Adam and Eve lived in, or it can be used to refer to the spiritual place where God interacts and dwells with man, and to some degree of a third heaven type of relationship that we're going to exist in with him in the world to come. Revelation 2:7 says, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. To him that overcometh will I give thee the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God," which is a reference to Eden. There's only two other places that Greek word paradisos, that's translated paradise there in Revelation 2:7, is used in the New Testament. One is in Luke 23:43 when Jesus says, "I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise," and Paul's statement in 2 Corinthians 12:4 where he says that he knew a man that was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words which is not lawful for a man to utter. Some take this description of Satan being in the Garden of Eden in this verse, and then later in verse 15, that iniquity was found in him and he was cast out in verse 16, as evidence that his fall didn't occur until after man was created and after he was involved with his temptation of man in the garden. I told you that's one of the options that some hold about when the corruption of Satan occurred. That it didn't occur prior to the creation of man, but occurred as a result of the creation of man, that jealousy or his own pride caused him to go too far with perhaps testing man in the garden. Maybe God's original intent was for him to test man in the garden. God certainly allowed him to do so, but that Satan went too far with it and lied to Eve and deceived her, and thus demonstrated the corruptness that was within him. And that may have been the beginning of his corruption being revealed. Ezekiel 28:13 describes 9 different precious stones being his covering. It's interesting because these are 9 of the 12 precious stones that were set in the breastplate of the high priest. You see that in Exodus 28:15-21. The 3 stones that aren't mentioned in Ezekiel 28:13 are the stones in the breastplate's third row, ligure, agate, and amethyst, which are listed in the 19th verse of Exodus 28. In Ezekiel's list here, in Ezekiel 28:13, gold is mentioned along with the 9 stones, and that probably isn't referring to a 10th stone, but to the material of the framework the stones were set in, which is what you see in Exodus 28:20. The complete number of 12 stones you see in the high priest's breastplate may be symbolic, as the number 12 is throughout Scripture, of government. The breastplate of the high priest represented his spiritual authority over the tribes, as well as his bearing of responsibility for their spiritual well-being. The fact that the stones we see covering this entity, who I believe Satan in Ezekiel 28:13, are not all 12 stones, but just 9 stones, might allude to the fact that Satan was not the highest governmental authority in the angelic realm, which he certainly wasn't, and that there could have been an angelic authority, perhaps speculating that that was Christ, that if he had been described with stones in this way, would have been described with all 12 stones, representing full governmental authority, because Christ alone is the one that bears the full authority as the heavenly high priest. And then the workmanship of his tabrets and pipes is described as being prepared in him in the day he was created, which, if this is referring to Satan, would have to be referring to the day he was created by Christ, because as we know, Jesus was the agent, God, who is the architect of the creation, used to create, as you see in 1 Corinthians 8:6, and Colossians 1:16, and Ephesians 3:9, and Hebrews 1:2. The Hebrew word that's translated tabrets here is toph, which can refer to a small handheld drum or a tambourine or even a timbrel. It's used 16 times in the Old Testament, and the King James translators always translated it timbrels or tabrets. A tabret, by the way, is a small drum. The Dictionary of Biblical Languages with Semantic Domains on the Hebrew language says this word refers to a setting or a mounting. In other words, the frame or bed in which a gem is set in some passages. It can refer to a pendant, like an ornament or some kind of adornment with gems in it, ear pendants, and it can refer to timbrels, tabrets, or different tympanic or percussive instruments. But their statement is that here in Ezekiel 28:13, the best translation of this would not be a musical instrument, but a setting or mounting, which, as we saw, is one of the ways it can be translated, and which might be referring to the setting or mounting for those gems that were referred to prior to this. The Hebrew word translated pipes is the word nekeb, which can refer to a socket, a mine that's a place where you're mining out ore, or a pipe in general. And it's the only place in the Bible that Hebrew word is used. Going back to the Dictionary of Biblical Languages with semantic domains on the Hebrew, it says that this can be translated as a mounting or setting, again, which would fit with the setting of gems and things that are referred to here. It can refer to as spangles or jewels, a mine, as I said, or pipes that are musical wind instruments. And again, their belief is that the word mounting or adornment fits the context best, which means it is more likely that this is just referring to the structure of the setting and things that these gems were in than it is to musical instruments, which leads to two of the main interpretations I've heard of what this could be referring to if it's referring to Satan. If the King James translation is correct, and this is referring to musical instruments in some way, some have extrapolated that out to infer that Satan was involved with music in heaven, since musical instruments are supposedly mentioned as part of his creation and activity. But if the correct translation is settings and sockets, which could be very likely, it would not be referring to musical instruments or anything related to music, but to the mountings in which the gems in the earlier part of the verse were placed. Ezekiel 28:14 says, "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee so. Thou wast upon the holy mountain of God. Thou wast walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire." The description of this entity as the anointed cherub that covereth is probably better translated as "you were the anointed cherub that covers," because there's no word art, A-R-T, in the original. It simply says, "Thou, the anointed cherub." So there's several different ways you could translate this. The English Standard Version translated it, "You were an anointed guardian cherub." The Hebrew word mimshak, which is the word translated anointed here, is only used this one time in the Bible. It usually refers to the idea of something that's spread over something, like outstretched wings being spread over something, which would connect with the idea of a cherub that is generally described with outstretched wings. There's several interpretations for this title. One is that God originally appointed Satan as a covering cherub in a positive sense, perhaps as one of the great guardian cherubs of the celestial realm, whose intended purpose was to be a guardian, so to speak, of the divine presence and of the purity of the things of God. His original role might have been as a prosecutor to maintain the purity of God's order, and if so, that would make perfect sense in some of his later actions we see described in the Bible that look like a prosecutor that has gone off the rails. somebody whose intent might have been to be a prosecutor, but is now not just prosecuting someone and wanting the facts to be revealed, but prosecuting someone and wanting the object of their prosecution to be harmed, and more than just prosecuted, persecuted. He may have become tainted by his pride and ambition that we see inferred in these verses and elsewhere, and became imbalanced in his ways. And instead of being a righteous prosecutor and a righteous guardian of the things of God, he became an adversarial prosecutor of mankind, and perhaps did so in a vindictive way because of jealousy or some other similar motive. After his fall began, which when I say began, I mean when corruption first entered into his heart, it may be that Satan was appointed by God as a covering cherub in a negative sense, because we do see a description of the earth being covered with a veil of darkness that's made up of the false beliefs and perverse practices that have covered mankind in a state of death and of hell. Isaiah 25:7 says, "He will destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people and the veil that is spread over all nations." So Satan may be the one who has cast that veil over all nations and is keeping man in that state of darkness. And God may have, as part of his judgment on mankind, set him in that position as part of the curse, and as a result of man surrendering that first dominion that God intended mankind to hold. That would be precisely why Satan would be referred to as the god of this world, because God has allowed him to hold that position as part of the curse. It describes him being upon the holy mountain of God, and a mountain in this kind of context in the Bible represents a place of government, whether in a celestial sense, where God's angelic host operates, or in a terrestrial sense, as a place where God exercises authority in the earth. And I think Satan was part of the structure and order of God's hierarchy and government in heaven before his fall. It goes on to say he walked up and down among the stones of fire. As with several of these, there's a number of different interpretive possibilities for what this might be talking about, and some of them might even overlap one another. The stones of fire might refer to the angels, or they might refer to the place of God's governmental operation and exercise of power, and that Satan was in a position of influence and or interaction with the angelic host in a place of power. Ezekiel 1:13-22 refers to the likeness of the living creatures, that their appearance is like burning coals of fire, unlike the appearance of lamps, which is one reason some would say that these stones of fire could be referring to angelic beings. Another reason is Hebrews 1:7, where he refers to his angels as spirits and his ministers as a flame of fire. Or Revelation 10:1, when it describes the feet of that mighty angel as being like pillars of fire. Or Daniel 7:9-10, which talks about the thrones being cast down, the Ancient of Days sitting, whose garment was white as snow, the hair of his head like the pure wool. His throne was like the fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire, and a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. All of which describe fiery elements associated with the innermost domain of God and his throne. The 16th verse, that we'll get to in a moment, states that he's going to be cast out of the mountain of God and destroyed out of the midst of the stones of fire, which interestingly enough is said as if it hasn't happened yet. Remember now, Ezekiel was written in the time of the 500s BC. So if God is not meaning this in a prophetic type of way about something that already happened, it could mean that even though he is still allowing Satan to operate on some level, which he clearly appears to be in the book of Job and elsewhere, that there is going to come a time when he is going to be completely cast down and destroyed. Ezekiel 28:15 says, "Thou wast perfect in thy ways from the day that thou wast created till iniquity was found in thee." I'm going to ask what I asked earlier. In what context could a human being other than Adam and Eve be described as perfect in their ways from the day of their creation, considering that their ways are describing their actions, their choices, their way of living, etc.? No human being has been perfect in their ways from the day they were created except for Adam and Eve. We were shapen in iniquity, as Psalms 51:5 said, and in sin our mothers conceived us, which means from the very beginning of our human existence, we are already sinful creatures. So no human could fit this description, but a celestial being certainly could if that celestial being later became corrupted, as we believe. So I believe Satan was a perfect being until iniquity was found in him, which is exactly what happened with Adam and Eve. They were perfect until they committed iniquity. But as I've shown, it cannot be Adam or Eve being described here, as this being is still someone who is presently alive and operating when this prophecy is being made and is described in ways that could not apply to Adam and Eve. I think the iniquity that was found in Satan was something that began in his heart. My speculation is that iniquity began working in Satan, perhaps at the time of the creation of man, and by the time of the testing in the garden, which he very well may have been intended by God to carry out as part of his role, if he was originally intended to be a testing agent, That iniquity rose up in the words that he used in lying to Eve and deceiving her and introducing that corruption to her. Ezekiel 28:16 says, "By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as profane out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy thee, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire." The 16th verse all the way down to the 18th verse lists the sins of this individual and the judgment that follows those sins. There's a pattern to the way it lists them. They're made up of groups of 2 sins followed by 2 judgments. The merchandise here in this passage is the same Hebrew word rekula, which is used for traffic later in verse 18. It essentially is referring to trade or traffic, like we think of commercial trade or trafficking drugs or something else. The New American Standard Bible translates this, "By the abundance of your trade you were internally filled with violence." And the English Standard translates it, "In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst." I believe Satan is in the business of selling, spiritually speaking, knowledge and information, just like he did in Eden, but it's a false and perverted knowledge that will lead man to corrupt himself and to eventually be destroyed. Satan is certainly in the spiritual business of the trafficking of polluted ideas, and just like someone who's a drug trafficker, introducing evil additives in terms of thoughts and desires that will addict man to perverse and corrupt things. Satan is in the power trade as well. He's always seeking more power, especially as this describes through the medium of violence, whether creating conditions of violence so that change can occur, because very often massive societal change does not occur until society reaches a peak of anger and violence that moves the societal levers and breaks up whatever the past foundations were, and that is certainly one of Satan's methods. Satan's merchandise, if you want to be poetic about it, is the message that he's selling. It's the product he's trying to produce in the human family. It's a message that begins with self-will and ambition and pride, and it escalates into the spiritual conditions of death and hell. "So I cast him as profane out of the mountain of God and destroyed him from the midst of the stones of fire." Cast and destroyed here are in the perfect and consecutive type of tenses in the Hebrew, which essentially means they're referring to something that may or may not be complete yet, but that is already seen as complete, which is exactly the way God would see this, because even if it hasn't happened yet in history in its fullness, God knows that he's going to do it, so to him it's already complete. Destroyed here is the Hebrew word abad, which can mean to be lost, ruined, or destroyed. In this case, I think it's probably referring to his loss of position and prominence when he was banished and cast down, though it could certainly refer to his final destruction. Profane here is the Hebrew word halal, which means polluted or defiled. It's a term that's usually associated with the priesthood, and Ezekiel, who is believed to have been of the priestly class, used it about 31 times in the book of Ezekiel. Because of Satan's defiled and polluted state, he was expelled and banished from the governmental operation of God and from a place of influence among the angels. Ezekiel 28:17 says, "Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of thy brightness. I will cast thee to the ground. I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee." His heart being lifted up because of his beauty and his wisdom being corrupted because of his brightness wasn't because he was bright in some holy and glorious sense that he was corrupted, because other angels who might be described that way weren't automatically corrupted just because of the type of glory that they existed in. It's because of his own estimation of his brightness, the pride and arrogance that he had about himself, that appears to have been the cause of his corruption. And wisdom, which is knowing the right way of approaching or handling something, can be corrupted by a lack of objectivity. It can be corrupted by making yourself the center of everything, and feeling self-important and being egocentric will cause you to make very unwise choices, especially in your interactions with others and in your presentation of yourself. That phrase, "I've cast you to the ground and laid you before kings," is very similar, as I said when I went through Isaiah 14, to the passage in Isaiah 14:9-11. I believe Satan can be cast down to the earth, cast down to the ground in a number of different ways. It could refer to him being cast out of the dimensional heavens, or being limited in his access to some of the heavenly realm. It could be referring to him being imprisoned or banished in some sense to the terrestrial realm. He could still operate, he could still move and act as a celestial being, but he could only do so within the terrestrial realm, so to speak. It could also refer to him being cast out of the religious heavens in a spiritual sense. And then finally, Ezekiel 28:18-19 says, "Thou hast defiled thy sanctuaries by the multitude of thine iniquities. By the iniquity of thy traffic, therefore will I bring forth a fire from the midst of thee. It shall devour thee, and I will bring thee to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold thee. All they that know thee among the people shall be astonished at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt thou be any more. Defiled here is the same Hebrew word halal, translated profane, back in verse 16. This is the only place in the Bible that halal, which in this context means defiled or polluted, is used in connection with what appears to be a pagan sanctuary. That word's most often used refer to some kind of sinful or unclean action that's been done that's brought pollution to God's order and operation, which, by the way, might infer this is not referring to a pagan sanctuary initially, but that he brought pollution to something that should have been God's. And if you look at the history of the church and what we believe about the falling away of the church, this could be a reference to the fact that initially the church was a holy sanctuary, but when the church fell away, it produced sanctuaries, not just the Eastern and Western Roman churches, but even some of the denominations that followed after them that were essentially daughters of that harlot, that were unclean sanctuaries, polluted sanctuaries. As I said, I think that could be a clue to the fact that these places were once gods, or should have been gods, but they've been defiled by Satan. And thus, by being defiled, they're no longer gods, and they are essentially, because God's allowed them to be, Satan's sanctuaries. And then we see what I believe is a description of him being cast in the lake of fire and destroyed, when it's talking about God bringing a fire from the midst of thee that would devour him and bring him to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all them that behold him. Revelation 20:10 said the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. When it describes it as a fire that shall devour thee, being brought to ashes, and never shalt thou be any more. What an incredible thing if that is speaking about Satan as we believe it to be, that one of these days his existence will be ended and he will never be any more. Considering all the preceding passages which I've given in the last several classes, some of which I do strongly believe refer directly or indirectly to the fall or corruption of celestial beings, there's one final thing I want to address that I've touched on throughout, and that is, when might this type of fall have occurred? And like with many of these things, there's several possibilities. Though I've touched on these throughout, I do want to finish this part of the subject of angels by touching on these one last time. It could be that the fall occurred in the primordial past, prior to the creation of the present universe, before the creation of the earth or man. But I think that's unlikely, given that when the universe is described as being created in Genesis, it appears that everything in it is still good and very good, and there is no hint of evil existing or of any problems going on. I think the statement of Job 38:7 might strongly support the belief that no fall had yet occurred at the time of the creation of the world. Because I believe Job 38:7, if you take the whole context, if you know what some of the Hebrew words there are referring to, might imply the celestial host was in a state of harmony at that time without any division. The whole context surrounding Job 38:7 is the original creation, so we have to conclude that Job 38:7 is referring to something that was occurring at the time of the original creation. When it says that the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. I believe these morning stars and sons of God were the celestial host that was present when God was creating the world by Christ. And the context, as I said, of this passage puts it at the time of the creation of the world. And both of those titles, morning stars and sons of God, are used for celestial beings in the Bible. The Hebrew word yachad, that's translated together here, refers to being one single group. It's the word used for being united. It comes from a root word meaning to be one. And the Hebrew phrase translated all the sons is kol b'nai, which refers to the whole group. In other words, all those who are the sons of God. Both of these Hebrew expressions imply that there was complete unity in this group of celestial beings. But it also implies there may not have been unity of this kind later in time, because there doesn't seem to be a reason to emphasize that all were together in a united way at the creation of the earth, unless at some later point all were not together and united in this way. If I were to refer back to a family reunion that I went to in the past by saying that all the family was present and in a state of unity, I think anyone hearing me say that would imply that may not be the case presently. That leads to the next possibility for when the celestial host may have become divided, at least in heart, if not in action, and that is sometime just after the creation of man, as I've referred to multiple times. That is my personal belief. And that is a strong possibility, as some of the passages we examine seem to infer, if not to state, that there may have been an issue of jealousy and pride among some of the celestial beings, which seems related to the creation of man and to God's intent to make this lesser race, at least lesser in the beginning, the rulers of his creation. Could have also begun with the activities of the serpent in the garden and the fall of man. And some believe Satan's words and his actions and his interaction with Eve revealed his corruption, which might have already begun working in his heart prior to that, going back to the last one, beginning with the creation of man. And some also believe those events in the garden were not just a test to reveal whether Adam and Eve were obedient, but to test Satan as well. And by the words and actions he chose, the very test he was carrying out of Adam and Eve revealed his corrupted state. And then some believe that the fall of the angels occurred during the time of Genesis 6, just prior to the flood. Those who might believe that celestial beings were involved in the events of Genesis 6 sometimes speculate that the corruption of the celestial host that began with Satan's fall, whether it happened back in the garden or prior, reached its peak at the time of Genesis 6 among those in the celestial host, when they, according to those that hold that view, took the actions ascribed in the first 4 verses of that chapter. Those who hold that view might also theorize that if there was a testing period for the celestial host that I've discussed in some of the previous classes, the time of the events of Genesis 6 might have been the ending point of that testing period, and that all who had become corrupted prior to the flood of Noah were at that point essentially locked into that state of corruption, and the test was over. Thus, all those who were now fully incorruptible would remain so, and we wouldn't have to wonder whether or not angels could still be corrupted. And those who are corrupted will remain in that state, which would perfectly match the description in 2 Peter 2 and Jude of angels who fell, left their first state and habitation, and are now in chains of everlasting darkness, referring to the fact they can never see or return to the light of relationship with God, and they cannot be redeemed from their corrupted state, and they're being held in that state until the judgment of the great day when they'll be eternally judged. And to close this out, I'm going to say again what I said when we talked about those passages. It seems beyond the pale to apply that kind of language to human beings who have left the church or who are even ministers that are teaching false doctrine, when it is certainly possible for those who have left the church to return, and for ministers, no matter how deep they may be in the spiritual darkness of false doctrine, to have those chains removed, meaning they could not be everlasting chains that are binding them until they are eternally judged, especially when we see passages like I talked about earlier in this same class, where the Lord is promising the removal of chains. Human beings have that incredible promise given to them, that even if we are presently in chains of spiritual darkness, we can have our chains removed. But I do not believe celestial beings, if they have been corrupted, as I believe that they have, can have their chains of darkness removed, and thus their chains are described as everlasting and intended to bind them until the judgment of the great day when Satan and his angels will be destroyed.